The world is arming itself at an alarming rate. That's what a recent report by Sipri, a Swedish-based research institute that tracks conflicts and arms control, said about global weapons purchases. Last year, global military spending crossed the $2 trillion mark for the first time. The five largest spenders, the US, China, India, the UK, and Russia, accounted for 62% of total defense expenditures. The report highlighted that despite the global COVID-19 pandemic, military spending remained largely unaffected and saw rapid growth compared to other sectors. But one of the most troubling points was that many of the world's nuclear-armed states are rapidly modernizing and expanding their arsenals. Although down from Cold War highs, Sipri warns that the era of nuclear disarmament appears to be ending. The warning comes as Russia's attack on Ukraine passed the 4-month mark. Tensions between the US and China have also risen this year, particularly over Taiwan and navigation rights in the South China Sea. So what impact will this increase in global arms spending mean for the world's security? And to discuss the trends in global military spending, joining me now from Bradford, England, is Owen Green. He's a professor at the University of Bradford. And from London, Elizabeth Brough. She's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. A warm welcome to you both, and thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk. Elizabeth, what's fueling this global arms buildup where military expenditures reached all-time high of $2.1 trillion in 2021?
Well, it's increasing fear among countries and citizens alike that the global world order that countries have built up over the past 30 years or so, that it's no longer working, and that's a really frightening state of affairs to be in, with countries not just squaring off militarily in as is taking place in Ukraine at the moment, but also preparing for potential wars and saying, well, what we have assumed would be the case, that we would be able to get along if we just had more dialogue and would trade more with one another. That's no longer working.
But Owen, the global arms industry is flourishing despite record inflation rates, high energy prices, and grim outlook for many sectors like technology. So why are weapons makers able to thrive despite a relatively weak and uncertain global economy?
But of course, nearly all of the weapons are bought by government through government budgets themselves. And so underlying all of the crises, there's still been some sort of growth amongst many economies. And so obviously countries like China, India, a number of the emerging developing countries are spending more, not only because, as was just said, there's increasing geostrategic tensions, but just because they are growing richer and they're increasing it. As far as NATO and Russia is concerned, of course, Russia has been at a high military expenditure proportionately for some time. But over the last couple of years, and particularly this year, of course, we're going to see a much higher growth than those increases have happened. But in the end, it relates to the fact that governments control those budgets, and government expenditure on defense is going up for the reason that was just mentioned.
So Elizabeth, Sipri, as we all know, a Swedish-based research group that tracks global arms sales, says that 2021 was the 7th consecutive year that spending increased. We know the effects of COVID-19 and we're amid the Ukraine crisis, but what has happened apart from these in the last 7 years that fueled this rapid growth?
So what's happened in Europe in particular, where we have seen a lot of growth in arms expenditures, is that countries after Russia's annexation of Crimea and the conflict in eastern Ukraine, European countries, including major ones like Germany, said the policy that we have been maintaining now for 20 years of essentially cutting our armed forces, not doing away with them altogether, but cutting them in the hope that the world will get ever more peaceful, that's not the case, and countries have been investing more and more in their armed forces, and that has been seen essentially across the board within NATO, where for many years you saw declining spending by almost every NATO member state, excluding the US and Greece, essentially. But spending has increased. And now we have this incredibly tense moment with regards to Russia and Ukraine, but also with regards to China and Taiwan. And countries are saying, well, we have to consider lots of different contingencies. And I have to say, on a personal note, it is really striking. I remember doing my first ever internship at Sipri in the 90s, working on nuclear disarmament, and it seems like a bygone era.
Okay, so Owen, are certain countries in danger of having to explain to their populations that during these tough times like soaring prices, that billions still need to be spent on defense?
Yes, I mean, it's always a tough sell for those countries which have democratic accountability, of course. And so, so that's been one of the main reasons of why many NATO countries have been quite slow to increase military expenditures despite widening security perceptions amongst experts, precisely because they're also under pressure to keep taxes low and to spend on social goods, which is quite right. Within India, China and so on, we're talking about countries that are not only growing relatively fast compared with others, but also where there's quite a strong sense that their destiny is as a greater major power, which includes military power. And I think amongst those states, there is a sort of sense that publics don't necessarily oppose it that much, even in India, where there is a democratic accountability process, because there is a sort of sense of national solidarity against threats. In India, it's primarily China, and in China, it's primarily the United States. And so there's a sort of ratchet effect going there. And also another very big factor, just to add one, is the dramatic changes in Japan's sense of its own insecurity over the last few years. Japan is, of course, a gigantic economy, but until very recently, it had committed to keep its defense expenditures below 1% of GDP, whereas they're now increasing it rapidly because of what they see as a China threat.
So, Elizabeth, Sipri says the global stockpile of nuclear weapons is expected to rise in the coming years. Is the world headed for a new nuclear arms race, and how dangerous it could get?
That seems to be the case, certainly the beginning of a nuclear arms race. We're not there yet. It is ironic that as we speak, the first ever conference on the abolishment of nuclear weapons based on the treaty that was signed by a number of UN member states recently has taken place in Vienna, but it has almost no significance because the countries that have signed that treaty are all non-nuclear weapon states anyway, and countries that already have nuclear weapons have not committed to abolishing them. And I think as recently as 5-10 years ago, that was a viable option. We should remember President Obama promised to slash US nuclear weapons. Yes. That went nowhere, and instead we are heading towards a revival of nuclear weapons. And we should remember that Russia is now doing a bit of saber rattling, talking about a potential nuclear response should NATO get involved in any sort of significant way in Ukraine. So it's a very perilous moment, especially considering that we have these quite significant stockpiles still.
So, Owen, what's your take on that? Are we headed for a new nuclear arms race?
I mean, I think there's a risk. What I read in the Sipri report is that essentially we're at an inflection point where the gradual reductions in nuclear weapons look as if they may be stopping. And of course, there are a couple of countries, particularly China, which is presently modernizing its nuclear delivery systems quite rapidly. And there's a big question about whether that's actually going to increase the number of nuclear warheads that they have on active deployments. Well, I'd be slightly cautious here is that I think probably it's not a nuclear arms race quite in the sense of the Cold War, where there's a genuine arms race in terms of numbers. There is the risk to do with India, Pakistan, and China in particular, and of course, North Korea. But I think what we're talking about here is a revival of attention being paid to the risks of nuclear war. And in that context, so it's in this context that the saber rattling, as it were, by Russia, which is a bit more than saber rattling. It's basically trying to leverage everything in order to intimidate some Russia and NATO countries from perhaps refraining to support Ukraine as much as they might otherwise do. But what's happening is there's all a question of quite what's happened. It's not just the numbers of nuclear weapons, but it's where they're being deployed and how. So there's, for example, just to illustrate, the risk that Russia has threatened quite often to forward deploy tactical nuclear weapons in a way that it had withdrawn in the 1990s, and it has forward deployed some of those. And so I would keep my eye less on the numbers and more on the sense that there may be a reviving risk that this becomes center stage in terms of insecurity of these major powers.
Yeah, so Elizabeth, meanwhile, from the report, we see the U.S. funding for military research and development rose by 24% between 2012 and 2021. What's the reason behind that?
So what's fascinating about military R&D is where it takes place. It used to be that military R&D was carried out by the government, by government institutes and agencies, and by the so-called primes, meaning the largest defense contractors. That is shifting radically. Defense R&D is taking place in a lot more frequently now in startups. So companies that are have cutting-edge technology, cutting-edge innovative ideas. And the question for the US government, and indeed every Western government or every government altogether, is how to get that pipeline of innovation going, because they have the established pipeline of government funded research happening in academia and within the government itself and in those primes. But how do we funnel and absorb the sort of innovation that's happening within startups that don't have necessarily have this massive machinery, and also not the massive experience in, for example, getting national security clearances for their staff. So all of that is changing radically.
All right, Elizabeth and Owen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.